The December wind howled through the cracks in the chapel walls like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of the harsh Wyoming winter to come. Sarah Whitmore stood at the altar in her simple calico dress, blue as a summer sky, the only brightness in the dim sanctuary, and tried to steady her trembling hands. The bouquet of dried wildflowers she clutched had been gathered months ago, preserved carefully for this day. At 23, she was no blushing bride. The black mourning dress she'd worn for 2 years hung in the trunk back at the boarding house. Finally retired, Jack Carver filled the small space before her like a mountain fills a valley. At 6 feet and 4 inches, with shoulders broadened by years of wrestling cattle and mending fences, he cut an imposing figure even in his Sunday best, a worn but clean black coat that stretched tight across his back. His hands, when they took hers, were rough as bark, each callus a testament to honest work. Sarah had seen those hands gentle a spooked mare and lift a newborn calf with equal tenderness. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Morrison, his voice competing with the wind, "we gather here in the sight of God to join this man and woman in holy matrimony." The congregation was small, a handful of neighboring ranchers and their wives, the shopkeeper, Mr. Hollis, and old Martha Brennan, the midwife who'd helped birth half the county and buried the other half. Sarah felt their eyes upon her, some curious, some knowing. They all remembered Thomas, her first husband, and little Emma. Scarlet fever had taken them both in the span of a week, leaving Sarah hollow as a bird's bone. Jack's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, bringing her back to the present. His eyes, gray as winter sky, held her steady in them. She saw not pity. She'd had enough of that to last a lifetime, but understanding and something else. Hope, perhaps, or promise. "Do you, Jackson Matthew Carver, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice rumbled deep as thunder, sure and steady. "To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer." Sarah's mind drifted to the homestead deed folded carefully in Jack's coat pocket. 160 acres of prairie land, registered in both their names, a gesture that had surprised her when he'd shown her the papers last week. "Equal partners," he'd said simply. "That's what marriage ought to be. Do you promise to love, honor, and protect her, as long as you both shall live?" Jack's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah knew that look. She'd seen it when he'd faced down claim jumpers last fall, when he'd pulled a trapped colt from a bog, when he'd made any promise he meant to keep come hell or high water. "I promise," he said, then added, his voice carrying over the wind, "I'll protect you, Sarah, even if I have to ride through blizzards or cross mountain stone. Nothing will keep me from you." A murmur ran through the small congregation. It wasn't part of the traditional vows, but Reverend Morrison, who'd known Jack since he was a boy, merely smiled and turned to Sarah. "And do you, Sarah Louise Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The words caught in her throat. 2 years ago, she'd been Sarah Parrish, cradling her daughter while her husband's fever raged. She'd made promises then too, to love, to honor, to cherish. She'd kept them all. Right until the earth closed over their graves. "Sarah?" The Reverend's voice was gentle. She looked up at Jack. He wasn't Thomas, quieter, steadier, with none of her first husband's easy charm or quick laughter. But perhaps that was what she needed now. Not someone who'd sweep her off her feet, but someone who'd help her find solid ground. "I do." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of ancient words and time-worn promises. When Jack slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, a match to the one she placed on his, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not the wild, reckless joy of her first wedding, but something deeper, like a seed planted in winter soil, waiting for spring. I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride. Jack's hands cupped her face with surprising gentleness. The kiss was brief, appropriate for the setting, but warm enough to chase the chill from the chapel. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Carver, Sarah caught Martha Brennan wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. The wedding breakfast was held at the boarding house, nothing fancy, just venison stew, cornbread, and dried apple pie. Sarah moved through it all feeling strangely outside herself, accepting congratulations and well wishes with a smile that felt both foreign and familiar. Jack stayed close, his presence solid and reassuring, occasionally touching her elbow or the small of her back. Gentle reminders that she wasn't alone anymore, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky the color of prairie roses. Jack helped Sarah into the wagon. Their few guests gathered to see them off, calling out final wishes and advice that the wind carried away. The 10-mile journey to the homestead stretched before them, the road already beginning to freeze in the lengthening shadows. Sarah pulled her woolen shawl tighter and studied her new husband's profile as he handled the reins. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hat sat low over his eyes, the steady competence in every movement. She'd known him for 6 months, since he'd hired her to help with the fall harvest cooking when his usual help had broken a leg. She'd watched him work from dawn to dusk, noticed how he treated his horses and his hired hands with equal respect, saw how he'd quietly left extra supplies on the doorstep of the widow Hanson when her husband died. Regrets already. His voice held a note of gentle teasing, but she heard the genuine question underneath. "No," she said, surprised to find it was true. "Just thinking about promises." She watched their breath cloud in the cooling air. "You made quite a vow back there, about riding through blizzards." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Meant every word, though I'm hoping it won't come to that. The winter's supposed to be hard this year. Mr. Hollis says the woolly caterpillars were showing thick bands. We'll manage. Got the root cellar full, plenty of hay stored, and firewood stacked to the eaves." He glanced at her. "And now I've got someone to share the coffee with when the mornings are cold." It was such a simple thing, but something about it, the easy assumption of companionship, of shared mornings and weathered storms, made her throat tight. She'd been alone for 2 years, had gotten used to silence and empty chairs. The thought of filling that silence again was both thrilling and terrifying. The homestead came into view as the last light faded from the sky. It wasn't much, a 2-room cabin with a lean-to kitchen, a barn that needed new shingles, a well with a squeaky pump. But smoke rose from the chimney. Jack had ridden out that morning to start the fire, and lamplight glowed warm in the windows. It looked like what it was, a beginning. Jack helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. For a moment, they stood there in the gathering darkness, the weight of the day and all its promises settling around them like snow. "Welcome home, Mrs. Carver," he said softly. Home. Such a simple word for such a complicated thing. Sarah looked at the cabin, at the man beside her, at the ring catching the lamplight on her finger. She thought of Thomas and Emma, always there like shadows at the edge of her vision. But for the first time in 2 years, those shadows didn't seem quite so dark. "Thank you, Mr. Carver," she said, managing a small smile. "Now, let's get inside before we freeze. A wife's first duty is making sure her husband doesn't catch his death on their wedding night." His laugh was rich and warm. "Yes, ma'am." As they walked toward their new life, Sarah didn't notice the clouds building on the northern horizon, heavy with the promise of storms to come. She was too busy thinking about fresh starts and second chances, about the surprising weight of hope in her chest, about the way Jack's hand felt steady and sure in hers. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled cheerfully, and their few possessions waited to be combined into one household. On the rough-hewn table sat the homestead deed, their names written side by side in the clerk's careful script. 2 gold rings caught the firelight. And outside, the Wyoming wind sang its ancient song, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of trials to come, trials that would test every word of the vows they'd spoken, in ways neither could imagine. But for tonight, there was warmth and light and the quiet beginning of something that might, with time and tending, grow into love. The first weeks of marriage passed in a rhythm of small discoveries and careful negotiations. Sarah woke each morning to find Jack already up, stoking the fire and heating water for coffee. He moved quietly for such a large man, trying not to wake her, though she'd been rising before dawn for years. She'd lie still for a few moments, watching him through half-closed eyes, learning the morning ritual of this stranger who was now her husband. "You don't have to pretend to sleep," he said one morning without turning around. "Coffee's almost ready." Heat crept up her neck. "How did you know?" "Your breathing changes when you wake." He glanced over his shoulder with a half-smile. "Plus, you stopped snoring." "I don't snore," she protested, sitting up and wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. "Like a little barn cat purring," he teased, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "It's nice. Lets me know you're there." It was comments like these, unexpected, gentle, revealing a loneliness he rarely spoke of, that began to chip away at the careful walls she'd built around her heart. The days fell into a pattern. After breakfast, Jack would head out to tend the cattle and repair fences while Sarah tackled the endless work of making a house a home. She scrubbed years of bachelor neglect from the floors, reorganized the pantry, patched the gaps in the walls with rags and mud. Jack had lived functionally but sparingly. She found only 2 plates, 3 cups, and a skillet so encrusted with old meals that it took an hour of soaking to restore it. "We need supplies," she announced one evening, showing him the list she'd been compiling. "Proper dishes, more blankets, lamp oil, needles and thread." "Whatever you need," he said, barely glancing at the list. "We'll go to town Saturday." His easy agreement surprised her. Thomas had questioned every penny, though he'd somehow always found money for whiskey and cards. She pushed the comparison away. Jack wasn't Thomas. That was the point. The trip to Bitter Creek took 3 hours over frozen roads. The town wasn't much, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a scattering of houses climbing the hillside like determined weeds. But after weeks of isolation, it seemed almost festive. Jack introduced her to people she'd only known by sight. Sam and Mary Patterson, who ran the dry goods store, the Fenwick brothers, who owned the largest ranch in the valley, young Dr. Henley, fresh from medical school back east. "So you're the woman who finally caught Jack Carver," said Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman with shrewd eyes and a warm smile. "We'd about given up hope. Man's been alone out there so long, we figured he'd forgotten how to talk to anything but cattle." "Now, Mary," Jack said mildly, but his ears reddened. "Don't you now marry me, Jack Carver. It's about time you had someone to look after you properly. All those years batting around that cabin like a marble in a can." She turned to Sarah with a conspiratorial wink. "You need anything, you come to me. I've been married 30 years come spring. I know all the tricks." As they loaded supplies into the wagon, Sarah noticed the looks and whispered conversations. She'd expected it. In a community this small, Jack Carver taking a wife, and a widow at that, was news worth discussing. Some of the glances were kind, others curious, a few skeptical. She held her head high and focused on Jack's steady presence beside her. "Don't mind them," he said quietly as they drove home. "Give it a month and they'll find something else to gossip about. I don't mind. I've been the subject of worse talk." She'd heard the whispers after Thomas died, about the drinking, the gambling debts, the nights he'd spent at the saloon. Some had pitied her. Others had suggested she'd driven him to it, as if a man needed a reason beyond his own weakness. Jack made a low sound that might have been agreement or anger. "Well, they'll have nothing but good to say about you as my wife, or they'll answer to me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed her more than the buffalo robe across their laps. Winter settled over the valley like a heavy hand. Jack taught her things she'd never needed to know as a shopkeeper's wife in town. How to read the signs of weather and the behavior of cattle. How to keep the water pump from freezing. How to bank the fire to last through the night. In turn, she transformed his bachelor cabin into something resembling a home. Curtains appeared at the windows, braided rugs covered the cold floors, and the smell of fresh bread replaced the lingering odor of bacon grease and loneliness. One evening, as snow began to fall, Jack came in from the barn shaking ice from his coat. "Lost a calf today," he said heavily. "Found it too late. Coyotes had been at it." Sarah ladled stew into bowls, giving him time to settle. She'd learned that Jack's griefs were private things, shared obliquely if at all. "I'm sorry," she said simply, setting the food before him. He nodded, staring into his bowl. "Part of ranching. Still hate it, though. Every loss feels personal." "Because you care," she said. "That's not a weakness." He looked up at her then, something shifting in his gray eyes. "Thomas was a lucky man," he said quietly. The mention of her first husband startled her. They'd had an unspoken agreement not to discuss the past, beyond the necessary facts. "Thomas is dead," she said carefully. "I know, I just meant—" He pushed the stew around his bowl. "You're a good woman, Sarah. Any man would be lucky to have you care whether he grieved for a calf." She didn't know what to say to that. So she said nothing, but she felt something ease between them, some invisible barrier growing thinner. The neighbor women began to visit once the roads were passable between storms. Martha Brennan came most often, bringing gossip and medical advice in equal measure. "You're looking better," she announced one afternoon, studying Sarah with a midwife's appraising eye. "Got some color back in your cheeks. Marriage agrees with you." Sarah busied herself with the teapot. "Jack's a good man. That he is steady as they come. Not much for conversation, but you can't have everything." Martha accepted her tea and leaned forward. "Any signs of a little one yet?" Heat flooded Sarah's face. "Martha, we've only been married 2 months. Never too early to hope. This house could use the sound of children." The older woman's expression softened. "I know it's hard, after losing your Emma. But that doesn't mean—" "I know what it doesn't mean," Sarah said more sharply than intended. The thought of another child terrified her. The vulnerability of it, the 1,000 ways a small life could be snuffed out. She'd held Emma as the fever consumed her, had sung lullabies to unhearing ears. How could she risk that again? Martha patted her hand. "Time enough for all that. Just remember, dear, living in fear of loss is just another kind of death." That night, as she lay beside Jack listening to his steady breathing and the wind rattling the windows, Sarah thought about Martha's words. Outside, she could hear the cattle lowing in the barn, the crack of ice forming on the water trough, the distant howl of wolves. The world was full of dangers, always had been. But here, in this small circle of warmth and light, she felt something she hadn't expected, safe. The news came on a gray February morning, delivered by Sam Patterson on his way back from the county seat. A massive blizzard was moving down from Canada, the worst in years. The old-timers were calling it a white death, the kind of storm that buried entire towns and froze cattle standing. It could be here in 3 days, maybe 4, Sam said, accepting coffee with grateful hands. Maybe it'll blow itself out before it reaches us, but I wouldn't count on it. Best prepare for the worst. After he left, Jack was quiet, calculating. Sarah watched him make mental lists: hay to be moved closer to the barn, extra wood to be split, gaps in the barn walls to be plugged. I need to make a run to town, he said finally. We're low on ammunition, and if we get snowed in for weeks, fresh meat will be scarce. I've got 3 deer hides and some beaver pelts to trade. Should get us through. When? She asked, though she already knew. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, I can make it there and back in a day if I push hard. She wanted to protest, to point out that the storm could come early, that the pelts could wait until spring. But she'd learned that Jack didn't make decisions lightly. If he said they needed supplies, they did. I'll have food ready for you to take, she said instead. And I'll prepare things here while you're gone. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. I'll be back before the storm hits, I promise. Sarah turned her hand palm up, lacing her fingers through his. She thought of his wedding vow, about riding through blizzards and crossing mountain stone. At the time, it had seemed like romantic hyperbole. Now, with the threat of a real storm bearing down on them, the words felt different, heavier. Just be careful, she said. Always am. He squeezed her hand gently. Got someone to come home to now. That night, they made love with unusual tenderness, as if both sensed the weight of approaching danger. Sarah traced the scars on his chest, from a longhorn's horn, a broken fence post, a dozen other hazards of ranch life, and thought about how fragile human bodies were, how easily broken. Stop worrying, he murmured against her hair. I can feel you thinking. I can't help it, she admitted. I've already lost. I know. He pulled her closer. But I'm not Thomas, Sarah, and I'm too stubborn to let a little snow keep me from my wife. She wanted to believe him. As she drifted off to sleep, lulled by his warmth and the familiar night sounds of the ranch. She almost did. But outside, the wind was picking up, and in the distance, clouds were gathering like an army massing for attack. The storm was coming, whether they were ready or not. Jack left before dawn, the wagon loaded with pelts and hides carefully bundled against the moisture. Sarah stood in the doorway, lamplight spilling around her into the pre-dawn darkness, watching him check the horses' harnesses one final time. The air had a peculiar stillness to it, the kind that made the hair on her neck prickle. Should be back by nightfall, he said, swinging up onto the wagon seat. Keep the fire going and don't fret about the chores, just stay warm. I'll be fine, she assured him, pulling her shawl tighter. You just mind yourself on those roads. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell, and she watched until the wagon disappeared into the gray half-light, the creak of wheels fading into silence. The emptiness that followed felt larger than it should have. Sarah busied herself with morning tasks, feeding the chickens, milking their 2 cows, checking on the horses left behind. By mid-morning, the promised stillness had given way to a restless wind that set her teeth on edge. She found herself glancing repeatedly at the northern horizon, where clouds were building like a wall of granite. Around noon, she was mending one of Jack's shirts when hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Her heart leaped, too early for Jack, and the rhythm was wrong, too urgent. She rushed to the window to see young Billy Henderson, the postal rider, sliding from his lathered horse. Mrs. Carver. He pounded on the door before she could reach it. Mrs. Carver, you there? She yanked open the door. Billy was perhaps 17, all knees and elbows, but his face wore an expression far too old for his years. What is it? Though she already knew, some part of her had known since Jack's wagon disappeared into the darkness. There's been an accident, ma'am. Your husband's wagon. He swallowed hard. Hit a patch of ice coming down Miller's grade. Wagon went over sideways. Mr. Carver, he got pinned underneath when it rolled. The world tilted. Sarah gripped the doorframe. Is he? He's alive, ma'am, but his legs hurt real bad. Maybe broke. Doc Henley's with him now at the Fulton place. That's the closest homestead to where it happened, about 15 miles north of here. Billy shifted anxiously. Doc says he can't be moved, not with the storm coming. Says the journey might kill him. Sarah's mind raced. 15 miles. In good weather. An easy ride. But with a blizzard bearing down. How long until the storm hits? Can't say for certain. Tonight maybe, tomorrow morning at the latest. It's moving fast. The boy looked miserable. I'm sorry, Mrs. Carver, I gotta keep riding, warn the other ranches, but Doc said to tell you Mr. Carver's asking for you. After Billy left, Sarah stood frozen in her kitchen, staring at nothing. The careful walls she'd built around her heart were crumbling, and behind them was a terror so vast she could barely breathe. Not again. She couldn't lose another husband, couldn't stand beside another grave, couldn't... No. She slammed her palm against the table, the sharp pain cutting through her panic. Jack was alive, hurt, but alive, and he needed her. She moved with sudden purpose, pulling on her warmest clothes, wool dress, 2 petticoats, Thomas's old coat that she'd kept because it was thicker than anything made for women. In a canvas sack. She packed blankets, the bottle of whiskey Jack kept for medicinal purposes, strips of clean cloth for bandages, dried beef, and hardtack. Her hands shook as she loaded Jack's revolver, checking the chambers twice before holstering it at her waist. The horses shifted nervously as she entered the barn, sensing the electricity in the air. She chose Duchess, Jack's steadiest mare, not the fastest, but sure-footed and calm. As she saddled her, she tried to calculate 15 miles in deteriorating weather, with night coming early this time of year. If she left now, she might make it before full dark. If the storm held off. If she didn't get lost. If. She was leading Duchess from the barn when another horse galloped into the yard. Martha Brennan, wrapped in so many layers she looked like a moving quilt pile, pulled up sharp. Sarah Carver, what in the name of all that's holy do you think you're doing? I'm going to my husband, Sarah said, checking the saddle's girth one more time. In this weather, child, that's madness. Then it's madness. Sarah swung up into the saddle with more determination than grace. But I won't sit here and wait for someone to bring me news of his death. Not again. Martha's expression shifted from disapproval to understanding. Wait. She dug in her saddlebags and pulled out a small leather pouch and a compass. Willow bark for the pain and fever. And this was my late husband's. It'll point you true even when you can't see the stars. She gripped Sarah's knee. Follow the stage road as far as Miller's grade, then cut east toward the Fulton place. There's a lightning-struck pine about a mile before their gate. You can't miss it. And Sarah, if that storm catches you... I know. Sarah tucked the items safely away, but I have to try. Martha nodded slowly. God go with you, child, and ride like the devil himself is after you. Sarah didn't need the encouragement. As soon as she cleared the ranch gate, she urged Duchess into a steady canter. The wind was picking up, driving bits of ice and snow into her face like tiny needles. To the north, the sky had turned an ominous yellow-gray, the clouds rolling and churning like a pot coming to boil. The first 5 miles passed in a blur of familiar landmarks. The cluster of cottonwoods where she and Jack had picnicked last fall. The creek crossing where he'd taught her to read the water's depth. The abandoned soddy where some hopeful homesteader had given up years ago. But as the road climbed toward Miller's Grade, the landscape became foreign, twisted by the strange light and rising wind. She found the site of the accident by the scar it had left, deep grooves where the wagon had slid, a scatter of trade goods still visible in the snow. Her stomach clenched as she saw the dark stains on the ground. Blood. Jack's blood. But there was no time to dwell on it. The temperature was dropping fast, and ice was forming on Duchess's whiskers. The stage road forked ahead, and Sarah pulled out Martha's compass, trying to hold it steady in the wind. East. She needed to go east. But which fork led east? They both seemed to curve away into the growing darkness. She closed her eyes, trying to picture Jack's descriptions of the area. He'd mentioned the Fulton place once, something about buying a bull from them last spring. A gust of wind nearly knocked her from the saddle, and Duchess danced sideways, whinnying nervously. Sarah made her choice, the left fork, and prayed she was right. The snow was falling steadily now, not the lazy flakes of a normal winter day, but hard, driven pellets that stung exposed skin and began to accumulate with frightening speed. Time lost meaning in the white swirl. There was only the rhythm of Duchess's labored breathing, the creak of cold leather, the howl of wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. Sarah's hands were numb inside her gloves, her face a mask of ice. More than once, she had to dismount and lead Duchess through drifts that were already knee-deep and growing. She almost missed the lightning-struck pine. It loomed out of the white suddenly, its blackened trunk split down the middle like a giant's broken tooth. Relief flooded through her. She was close. But as she remounted, Duchess stumbled, favoring her right foreleg. "No," Sarah whispered, running her hand down the horse's leg. "Please, no." There was heat and swelling above the hoof, not broken but strained. Duchess could walk, but their pace slowed to a painful plod. The storm was fully upon them now, the world reduced to a tiny sphere of whirling white. Sarah could barely see Duchess's ears, let alone any sign of the Fulton homestead. Then, a light, faint and flickering through the snow, but unmistakably a light. Sarah urged Duchess toward it, praying it wasn't her desperate mind playing tricks. The light grew stronger, multiplied into windows glowing with lamplight. The bulk of a house materialized from the storm like a ship from fog. "Hello," Sarah shouted, but the wind tore the word away. "Someone help!" The door opened, spilling warmth and light into the Arctic night. A woman's figure appeared, Mrs. Fulton, round and capable-looking, already reaching out to help Sarah from the saddle. "Lord have mercy, you're the Carver woman. Come in, come in. We didn't think anyone could get through." Sarah's legs buckled as she dismounted, and Mrs. Fulton caught her, half dragging her toward the door. "My husband," Sarah gasped through chattering teeth. "He's here. He's alive," Mrs. Fulton assured her. "Though Lord knows how you made it through that storm. Must be made of stronger stuff than you look." As Sarah stumbled into the blessed warmth of the house, she heard Jack's voice, weak but unmistakably alive, calling her name from the next room. She'd made it. They both had, so far. But outside, the storm raged on, and she knew their trials were far from over. The blizzard had found them at last, and it was only beginning to show its teeth. Mrs. Fulton guided Sarah to a chair by the fire, clucking like a mother hen. "You're half frozen, child. Let me get these wet things off you." But Sarah was already pushing past her, moving toward the sound of Jack's voice. She found him in the back room, lying on a narrow bed with his left leg splinted and elevated. Dr. Henley sat beside him, and both men looked up as she appeared in the doorway. "Sarah." Jack's face was gray with pain, but his eyes lit up at the sight of her. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "You asked for me," she said simply, crossing to his side. His hand, when she took it, was too warm, fever already setting in. "I meant after the storm passed." His fingers tightened around hers. "You rode through that? Appears your wife is cut from the same cloth as you." "Carver," Dr. Henley said, rising to give Sarah his chair. "Though I'd say she's got more sense than you showed, trying to handle that grade with an overloaded wagon." Sarah barely heard him. She was cataloging Jack's injuries, the splinted leg, obviously, but also a gash on his forehead, roughly stitched, and the way he held his left side suggested cracked ribs. "How bad?" she asked the doctor quietly. "The legs broke clean, that's the good news. Should heal straight if he stays off it. But there's always risk of infection. And this fever worries me." Henley was young, perhaps 30, with the earnest manner of someone still believing he could save everyone. "I've done what I can, but moving him now." He shook his head. "Then we don't move him," Sarah said firmly. She looked around the small room, taking stock. "Mr. and Mrs. Fulton, I can't thank you enough for taking him in." "Wasn't a question of taking him in," Mrs. Fulton said from the doorway. "Christian duty aside, your man likely saved our boy last winter when he pulled him from the river. We don't forget such things." The wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass in its frames. Sarah could hear the Fultons' children in the main room, their voices high with excitement and fear. How many souls were crowded into this small house, waiting out the storm? "I need to see to my horse," Sarah said, starting to rise, but Mrs. Fulton pressed her back down. "My husband's already taken her to the barn, rubbing her down good. That's a fine animal. Not many could have carried you through this weather." She studied Sarah with knowing eyes. "When did you last eat?" Sarah couldn't remember. This morning, yesterday. Time had compressed into the single goal of reaching Jack. "Thought so. I'll bring you something. Can't have you collapsing now that you're here." When she left, Sarah turned back to Jack. His eyes were closed, but she knew he wasn't sleeping by the tension in his jaw. "The pain's bad," she said. It wasn't a question. He had worse, but sweat beaded his forehead despite the room's chill. Sarah pulled out Martha's pouch of willow bark. "Mrs. Brennan sent this. I'll make you some tea." "Sarah." He opened his eyes. "I'm sorry. Should have waited. Should have—" "Hush." She smoothed the hair back from his forehead. "No sense in should-haves. We're here now. You could have died coming after me. When I saw you walk through that door, I thought I was dreaming. Or dead. You're not getting away from me that easily, Jack Carver." She tried for lightness, but her voice cracked. "Though if you ever scare me like this again—" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." The night stretched endlessly. Sarah divided her time between tending Jack and helping the Fultons manage their household of 8 children, from a toddler to a boy of 16. The storm hammered at the walls like a living thing trying to get in. At times, the wind was so loud that conversation became impossible, and they all sat in silence, listening to the house groan under the assault. Jack's fever climbed despite the willow bark tea. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes mumbling about cattle prices and fence lines. Sarah bathed his face with cool water and tried not to think about Thomas. about another fevered bedside vigil that had ended in tragedy. Different, she whispered to herself like a prayer. This is different. Dr. Henley dozed fitfully in a chair, waking periodically to check Jack's pulse and temperature. Around 3 in the morning, he pulled Sarah aside. The fever's not breaking. I'm worried about infection setting in. He looked exhausted, older than his years. There's only so much I can do with what I have here. What does he need? Time. Rest. Medicine I don't have with me. He glanced at the frost-covered window. And for this damned storm to break so I can get him proper help. Sarah squared her shoulders. Then we give him what we can and pray for the rest. Dawn came without any lessening of the storm's fury. If anything, it seemed worse. The snow now drifted halfway up the windows, and the temperature inside the house dropped despite the constantly fed fire. The Fulton children huddled together under quilts, wide-eyed and quiet. Sarah was changing the dressing on Jack's head wound when he grabbed her wrist. His eyes were clear for the first time in hours. Sarah, listen. His voice was rough but urgent. If something happens, nothing's going to happen. Listen to me. His grip tightened. The deed to the ranch is in the strongbox under our bed. The combination is your birthday, month and day. Everything's in both our names. You won't have to fight for it. Jack, stop. And there's money saved. Not much, but enough to see you through spring. Sam Patterson knows which cattle are marked for sale. Jack Carver, you stop this right now. Tears burned her eyes. You're not dying. I won't let you. I didn't ride through a blizzard to watch you give up. He studied her face for a long moment. You're stronger than you know, Sarah. So are you. Now prove it. But as the day wore on, Jack's condition worsened. The fever spiked dangerously high, and he stopped responding to voices or touch. Doctor. Henley tried everything in his limited arsenal, but Sarah could see the defeat creeping into his eyes. Late in the afternoon, as the storm continued its relentless assault, Sarah made a decision. She pulled on her still damp coat and headed for the door. Where are you going? Mrs. Fulton demanded. The barn. Jack told me once that his grandmother used to make a poultice from potato and charcoal for blood poisoning. You have potatoes in your root cellar? Yes, but you can't go out in this. It's not far. Sarah wrapped a rope around her waist, handing the other end to Mr. Fulton. If I get turned around, pull me back. The journey to the barn, perhaps 50 feet in clear weather, became an Arctic odyssey. The wind knocked Sarah to her knees twice, and the snow was now chest-deep in places. But she reached the barn, found what she needed, and fought her way back. As she prepared the poultice with Mrs. Fulton's help, she thought about the morning Jack had mentioned his grandmother. They'd been fixing fence, and he'd cut his hand on barbed wire. Such a small memory, filed away without thought. Now it might save his life. They applied the poultice to Jack's leg, which had begun to show angry red streaks, the sure sign of infection, Dr. Henley had feared. There was nothing to do but wait and pray. Night fell again, though it was hard to tell in the perpetual gray of the storm. Sarah sat by Jack's bed, holding his hand, whispering stories about their future, the children they'd have, the additions they'd build onto the cabin, the cattle empire they'd create together. Whether he heard her or not, she couldn't say, but she needed to speak the words, to will them into being. Sometime after midnight, she dozed off in her chair. She woke to a strange sound, or rather the absence of sound. The wind had stopped. The storm's breaking, Mr. de Fulton said from the doorway, wonder in his voice. Temperature's dropping fast, but the worst is past. Sarah turned to Jack, hardly daring to hope. His forehead, when she touched it, was cooler. His breathing seemed easier. As she watched, His eyes fluttered open. "Sarah?" His voice was weak but coherent. "You're still here." "Where else would I be?" She squeezed his hand, tears flowing freely now. "We made it through, Jack. Both of us." He managed a slight smile. "You rode through a blizzard for me, and I'd do it again." She meant every word, though I'd prefer not to. Dr. Henley, awakened by their voices, checked Jack thoroughly and pronounced the fever breaking and the infection retreating. "I'd say it's a miracle, but I suspect it has more to do with your wife's stubbornness than divine intervention." As dawn broke clear and bitter cold, Sarah finally allowed exhaustion to claim her. She fell asleep in the chair, her hands still clasping Jack's, while outside the world emerged from its white shroud, transformed but enduring. They had survived the storm. But more than that, they had found in its crucible a love forged stronger than any they had known before. The morning sun glinted off snow crystals like scattered diamonds, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost magical. Sarah stood at the Fultons' kitchen window, cradling a cup of coffee and watching Mr. Dinuth Fulton and his oldest boy dig a path to the barn. The storm had left drifts higher than a man's head, reshaping the familiar world into an alien terrain. "You should eat something," Mrs. Fulton said, setting a plate of biscuits and gravy on the table. "You've barely touched food in 2 days." Sarah turned from the window reluctantly. Her whole body ached from the ride and the sleepless nights. But she felt strangely energized. Jack was alive. The fever had broken. Everything else could be managed. "How is he this morning?" Mrs. Fulton asked, sitting across from her. "Complaining about being stuck in bed. I take that as a good sign." Sarah managed a small smile. "Dr. Henley says we still can't move him for at least a week, maybe 2. I'm sorry to impose on your hospitality for so long." "Nonsense, after what your husband did for our William." Mrs. Fulton shook her head. "Besides, the company's welcome. Gets lonely out here in winter with just the children and Harold for conversation." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the children stirring upstairs and the men's voices carrying from outside. Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that still lay ahead, getting Jack home once he could travel, managing the ranch alone while he recovered, the mountain of work that would have accumulated in their absence. "Mama," one of the younger Fulton boys burst into the kitchen. "Riders coming, looks like a whole party." Sarah's heart jumped. In weather like this, riders meant either very good news or very bad. She followed Mrs. de Fulton to the door, squinting against the brilliant snow glare. 3 riders were indeed approaching, their horses struggling through the drifts. As they drew closer, Sarah recognized the lead figure, Sam Patterson from town, followed by 2 men she didn't know. "Mrs. Carver," Sam called out as soon as he was within earshot. "Thank the Lord you're safe. When we heard what you'd done riding out in that storm, well, half the town's been praying for you both." The men dismounted, stomping snow from their boots. Sam made introductions. The other 2 were brothers, Frank and Joseph Myers, who owned the neighboring ranch to the south. "We came as soon as the weather cleared," Frank Myers said. He was a gruff man in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life fighting the elements. "Wanted to see what help you might need. That was a damn fool thing you did. Pardon my language, ma'am. Also the bravest thing I've heard tell of in 20 years of ranching." Heat crept up Sarah's neck. "I did what anyone would do for their husband." "No, ma'am," Joseph Myers said quietly. He was younger than his brother, with kind eyes. "Most would have waited for the storm to pass and hoped for the best. What you did, well, it's already becoming a legend in these parts." "How did you even know we were here?" Sarah asked, desperate to change the subject. Young Billy Henderson made it through to town before the worst of it hit. Told everyone about Jack's accident and how you'd lit out after him. Martha Brennan added that you'd headed for the Fulton place. Sam's expression grew serious. How is Jack? Recovering. His leg's broken, but the fever broke last night. Dr. Henley says he'll mend, given time. Thank God for that. Sam reached into his saddlebags. I brought some supplies. Figured you might be running low after housing extra folks. And Mrs. Patterson sent some of her preserves and a letter for you. Sarah accepted the supplies gratefully. As the men went to check on Jack, she opened the letter from Mary Patterson. It was full of news from town, offers of help, and gentle gossip. At the bottom, Mary had written, My dear, what you did has given us all something to talk about besides the weather. You've shown us what real love looks like, not pretty words, but action when it counts. We're all proud to call you neighbor. The tears came then, sudden and unstoppable. Sarah sank into a chair, the letter crumpling in her hands. For 2 years, she'd held herself apart, afraid to fully belong anywhere, afraid to risk her heart again. But these people, practical, unsentimental ranchers and their wives, had claimed her as one of their own. Hey, Sarah? Jack's voice carried weakly from the other room. You all right out there? She wiped her eyes quickly and went to him. The men had gathered around his bed, discussing cattle prices and spring plans as if Jack weren't lying there with his leg in splints. It was their way, she realized, of making him feel normal, connected to the life waiting for him beyond this sick room. The Myers brothers brought news from town, she told him, perching carefully on the edge of the bed. Apparently, I'm famous. Jack's eyes found hers, full of something deep and unspoken. You should be. What you did was necessary, she interrupted, and I'd do it again. I know, he said softly. That's what terrifies me. The men talked for another hour, making plans. The Myers brothers offered to check on the Carver ranch, tend the stock, keep the water troughs clear. Sam would arrange for supplies to be brought out once the roads were passable. Dr. Henley, who had joined the gathering, gave strict instructions for Jack's care. 2 weeks minimum before we even think about moving him, the doctor said firmly. That leg needs to start knitting properly, and I want no weight on it for at least a month after that. Jack groaned. A month? The calving will start. The calving will be handled, Frank Myers interrupted. Between my boys and yours truly, your cows will be fine. You just focus on healing so your wife doesn't have to ride through any more blizzards. After the men left, promising to return in a few days. Sarah found herself alone with Jack for the first time since her arrival. The house had settled into afternoon quiet, the children napping or playing quietly upstairs. You scared me, she admitted, adjusting his blankets unnecessarily. When Billy told me you were hurt, all I could think about was... She stopped, unable to voice the fear that had driven her into the storm. I know, Jack caught her hand. I'm sorry, I should have been more careful. It was an accident. Ice doesn't care how careful you are. She squeezed his fingers. But you're right about one thing. I am terrified. Not of storms or wolves or any of the 100 dangers out here. I'm terrified of losing you. You won't. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. But I can promise to fight like hell to stay with you, and apparently, a slight smile tugged at his lips. You'll fight even harder to keep me. Sarah thought about the journey through the blizzard, the moment when she'd almost turned back, when the cold and fear had nearly won. But stronger than both had been the image of Jack alone and fevered, needing her. Love. She was learning. wasn't just the warm feeling in her chest when he smiled. It was choosing to saddle a horse in a killing storm. It was the weight of the gun at her hip and the compass in her pocket. It was action, not words. The pastor read from Corinthians at our wedding. She said quietly, "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." I thought they were just pretty words. Now I understand love is a verb, not a feeling. Jack's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "How did I get lucky enough to find you?" "Lucky?" Sarah laughed, but it was watery. "Jack Carver, you married a widow who's afraid of her own shadow half the time, who can barely manage the egg money, who rode through a blizzard to save my sorry hide," he interrupted, "who turned my cold cabin into a home, who looks at me like I'm worth something more than the dirt on my boots." His voice roughened. "I meant what I said at our wedding. About riding through storms for you. I just never imagined you'd be the one doing the riding." Well," Sarah said, striving for lightness. "Next time you can be the hero. I'm perfectly happy to stay home by the fire." "Deal." He pulled her down for a kiss, gentle and full of promise. "Though something tells me you're not the staying by the fire type anymore." As afternoon faded into evening, Sarah sat with Jack, reading aloud from one of Mrs. Van Fulton's books while he dozed. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, but the sky remained clear. Soon, they could go home. There would be challenges, managing the ranch while Jack recovered, the endless work of spring, the uncertainties that came with making a life in this unforgiving land. But for now, they were together, warm and safe, surrounded by the quiet kindness of neighbors. The storm had tested them and they had not broken. If anything, they had been forged stronger, like metal in a fire. Sarah looked at her husband's sleeping face, younger looking in repose, and felt her heart swell with a love that was no longer tinged with fear. She had ridden through her worst nightmare and emerged on the other side. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. The young bride who had stood trembling at the altar 2 months ago was gone. In her place sat a woman who knew her own strength, who had looked death in the eye and refused to yield. A woman who understood that love wasn't a shelter from life's storms, but the courage to face them head on. And outside, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, bright and cold and eternal, keeping watch over the small human dramas playing out beneath them. The wind struck her first as she rounded the overturned wagon, not the familiar Wyoming gusts she'd grown accustomed to, but a savage, living thing that drove ice crystals into her exposed skin like tiny daggers. Duchess whinnied and tried to turn back, but Sarah held firm, her frozen hands barely able to grip the reins. There, a flash of color against the white, Jack's red flannel shirt, visible where the canvas had torn away. He lay twisted beneath the wagon bed, his left leg bent at an angle that made her stomach lurch. One of the horses, poor Samson, lay still in the traces, his great body already beginning to stiffen in the cold. The other horse was gone, broken free in the chaos. "Jack!" She slid from Duchess's back, immediately sinking to her knees in the snow. The drift here was deeper than she'd expected, and for a terrifying moment, she floundered, unable to find purchase. Jack's eyes opened as she reached him, unfocused and glassy with pain. "Sarah." His voice was barely a whisper. "No, you shouldn't. The storm." "Hush." She pulled off her gloves with her teeth, needing bare hands to work despite the cold. Quick assessment. The leg was certainly broken, caught beneath the wagon's weight. His face was gray, lips tinged blue, and when she touched his forehead, it burned with fever even in this frigid air. The wagon had lodged against a cluster of rocks. which had prevented it from crushing him entirely but also made it impossible to simply pull him free. Sarah looked around desperately. She needed leverage, needed to lift the wagon enough to extract his leg without causing more damage. "Can you feel your foot?" she asked, already knowing the answer from the way he grimaced. "Hurts like blazes," he managed. "Sarah, listen. You need to go. Get help." "I'm not leaving you." She stood, surveying the wreckage. There, a long pole from the wagon's frame had broken free. It would have to do. The next 20 minutes were among the longest of her life. Using the pole as a lever and stones as a fulcrum, she managed to raise the wagon bed inch by agonizing inch. Jack bit down on the leather of his belt to keep from screaming, the cords in his neck standing out with the effort. When she'd created enough space, she grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He passed out from the pain, which was a mercy. Sarah dragged his unconscious form clear of the wagon, her own body screaming in protest. She'd never moved anything so heavy, never pushed her physical limits so far, but adrenaline and desperation gave her strength. She didn't know she possessed the whiskey. She needed the whiskey, fumbling in her pack with numb fingers. She found the bottle and forced a small amount between Jack's lips. He sputtered, coughed, and his eyes fluttered open. "You need to splint the leg," she said, already looking for materials. 2 straight pieces from the broken wagon side would work. She used strips torn from the blanket to bind them, trying to remember what Dr. Henley had shown her when young Tom Morrison broke his arm last summer. Jack groaned as she worked, drifting in and out of consciousness. The storm was worsening by the minute. She could barely see 10 feet in any direction, and the temperature was dropping fast. They couldn't stay here. They'd freeze to death within hours. "Jack, I need you to help me." She wrapped the remaining blankets around him, tucking them tight. "We have to get you on the horse." "Can't," he mumbled. "Too heavy. Leave me." "Don't you dare!" Her voice cracked with emotion and cold. "You promised to protect me, Jack Carver. Well, now it's my turn. And I'll be damned if I'm going home a widow again." Something in her tone must have reached him. His jaw set with determination, and he nodded weakly. It took 3 attempts and strength born of sheer will, but together they managed to get him draped across Duchess's back. Sarah used the rope from her pack to secure him, looping it under the horse's belly and around Jack's torso. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. She took Duchess's reins and began the long walk back. Leading the horse was safer than riding. She could feel for obstacles buried in the snow, keep them from wandering off course. But it also meant she bore the full brunt of the storm. Within minutes, she lost all sense of direction. The world had become a howling white void. Only Martha's compass kept her oriented, though she had to stop every few steps to check it, brushing away the accumulating snow with fingers that no longer felt like her own. Jack mumbled deliriously, sometimes calling her name, sometimes talking to people who weren't there. Once, he seemed to think she was his mother, long dead these 15 years. The sound of his voice, even confused and rambling, helped her push forward. As long as he was talking, he was alive. The cold was an enemy more implacable than any she'd faced. It crept through her layers of clothing, turning her limbs to wood, making each step an act of supreme will. Her face was a mask of ice. She could no longer feel her feet. Several times she stumbled and fell, and each time it was harder to get up. Just a little farther, she told herself, though she had no idea if it was true. They could be wandering in circles for all she knew. The compass pointed east, but east to what? Had she passed the lightning-struck pine? Was she even on the right path? Duchess stopped suddenly, refusing to go forward. Sarah tugged at the reins, frustrated, until she realized why. They'd reached the edge of a drop-off, invisible in the white. Another step and they'd have plunged down who knew how far. She led them carefully along the edge until she found a safer descent. The detour cost precious time and energy. Jack had stopped talking, and when she checked on him, his breathing was shallow, labored. The fever was consuming him even as the cold tried to claim them both. Then, a miracle. Or perhaps just the reward for stubborn persistence. A dark shape loomed out of the storm. The lightning struck pine, its blackened trunk unmistakable even in near whiteout conditions. She nearly wept with relief. From here, she knew the way, but knowing and doing were different things. The final mile to the Fulton homestead was the hardest ground she'd ever covered. She was beyond cold now, beyond exhaustion. Moving on nothing but will and the knowledge that stopping meant death for them both. She began talking to Jack, to Duchess, to herself, anything to stay focused. She told Jack about the first time she'd seen him, how his hands had been gentle with the injured calf. She reminded him of their wedding night, the tentative hope they'd shared. She painted word pictures of their future, spring calves, summer gardens, children playing in the yard. "You have to live to see it," she said through cracked lips. "You promised to protect me, remember? Can't do that if you're dead." The lights of the Fulton place appeared so suddenly she thought she was hallucinating. But no, there was the house, the barn, salvation just yards away. She tried to call out but could only manage a croak. Somehow they heard her anyway, or perhaps they'd been watching. The door flew open and Mr. Fulton rushed out, followed by his oldest boy. Hands reached for her, for Jack, for Duchess's reins. Voices exclaimed in shock and admiration. "Hey, Lord Almighty, Mrs. Carver, you made it. We didn't think anyone could get through this." Sarah tried to answer, tried to explain, but her legs gave out. Someone caught her, Mrs. Fulton's strong arms, and half carried her toward the blessed warmth of the house. Jack," she managed to say. "Help Jack first." "We've got him," Mr. Fulton assured her. "Doc Henley's already here. Got caught by the storm on his way back from the Morrison place. Lucky thing, too." The warmth hit her like a physical blow. Pain exploded through her extremities as feeling began to return. Mrs. Fulton was peeling away her frozen outer garments, exclaiming over the ice in her hair, the frost on her eyelashes. 15 miles in this weather," the woman kept saying. 15 miles through a blizzard, and child, you've got more grit than any 10 men I know." But Sarah wasn't listening. Her attention was fixed on the doorway where they were carrying Jack, on Dr. Henley's serious face as he began his examination. She'd done it, brought him through the storm to safety. But would it be enough? Or had she simply delivered him to a warm place to die? "Please," she whispered, though whether to God or the doctor or the universe itself she couldn't say. "Please let him live. I can't do this again. I can't lose another one." Mrs. Fulton pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. "Faith, child. You've done the impossible already. Have faith for just a little more." Sarah wrapped her fingers around the cup, feeling the burn of returning circulation, and tried to believe. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, 2 lives hung in the balance, waiting for fate or providence or simple human stubbornness to tip the scales. She had ridden through the storm. Now came the harder task, waiting to see if love and determination would be enough to see them both through to morning. The fever lasted 3 days. 3 days of Jack thrashing in delirium, calling out for cattle that weren't there, fighting battles with claim jumpers who existed only in his fever-addled mind. Sarah barely left his side, cooling his burning skin with damp cloths. spooning willow bark tea between his cracked lips, changing the poultices on his leg that Dr. Henley insisted were keeping the infection at bay. "You need to rest," Martha Brennan told her on the second day. The midwife had somehow made it through the lessening storm, determined to help. "You're no good to him if you collapse." But Sarah couldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas in Jack's place. Felt again the terrible stillness when the fever finally broke, not in healing, but in death. She couldn't live through that again. On the third night, as wind still rattled the windows but with less fury than before, Jack's fever spiked dangerously high. Dr. Henley's young face was grave as he pulled Sarah aside. "We've done all we can. The next few hours will tell." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Perhaps you should prepare yourself." "No." The word came out harder than she intended. "No, I won't prepare for anything except his recovery." She returned to Jack's bedside, took his hot hand in both of hers, and began to talk. She told him about the ranch waiting for them, about the spring calves that would need naming, about the garden she planned to plant come May. She talked until her throat was raw, painting their future in words when reality seemed determined to snatch it away. Sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally claimed her. She dozed with her head on the edge of his bed, still clutching his hand. She woke to a different quality of stillness and jerked upright, heart hammering. Jack's eyes were open, clear and focused for the first time in days. "Sarah?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it was him. Not the fevered stranger who'd inhabited his body, but her Jack. She pressed her hand to his forehead. "Cool. Blessedly, miraculously cool." "The fever broke," she breathed, then louder. "Martha, Dr. Henley, the fever's broken." The house erupted in quiet celebration. Dr. Henley examined Jack thoroughly, pronouncing the crisis past, though warning that recovery would be slow. Martha bustled about making strengthening broth. Mrs. Fulton whispered prayers of thanksgiving, but Sarah only had eyes for Jack, who was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You look terrible," he said finally, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. She laughed, or maybe it was a sob. "You're one to talk." "How long?" 3 days since I brought you here. You've been away." His brow furrowed as memory returned in pieces. "The storm. You came for me and through the blizzard. Someone had to. You're terrible at keeping yourself in one piece." His hand tightened on hers. "Sarah, what you did is exactly what you would have done for me." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead, gentle as she'd been during his fever, but steadier now. "That's what marriage is, isn't it? Taking turns saving each other." Over the following days, as the storm finally blew itself out and the world emerged into crystalline winter sunshine, Jack began the slow journey back to strength. The broken leg, miraculously, showed no signs of infection. Dr. Henley credited Sarah's quick action in splinting it and the poultices that had drawn out any poison. "You'll limp for a while," the doctor warned. "Maybe always, if it doesn't heal quite straight, but you'll walk, and that's more than I'd have bet when they first brought you in." Jack bore the confinement with less grace than he'd borne the pain. By the 5th day, he was restless as a caged wolf, fretting about the ranch, the cattle, the dozen tasks that needed doing. "Frank Myers and his boys have it well in hand," Sarah reminded him for the 10th time. "Your only job is to heal." "I'm not used to being useless," he grumbled. "You're not useless, you're recovering. There's a difference." She adjusted his pillows with brisk efficiency. "Besides, this gives us time." "Time for what?" "To talk. To know each other better." She settled into the chair beside his bed with her mending. "We've been married 2 months. Jack Carver." And I still don't know your middle name. Matthew, he supplied. After my grandfather. Mom, what else do you want to know? Everything, it turned out. As the days passed and Jack grew stronger, they talked as they never had before. He told her about growing up on a failing farm in Missouri, about coming west at 17 with nothing but ambition and a strong back. She shared memories of her childhood in Ohio, her first marriage, even, haltingly, about losing Emma. She had Thomas's eyes but my stubbornness, Sarah said one evening, working on a patch for one of his shirts. The fever took her so fast. One day she was playing with her rag doll. The next. She shook her head. I thought I'd never risk that kind of love again. But you did, Jack said quietly, and with me. She looked up from her sewing. Yes, though I didn't mean to. You snuck up on me, Jack Carver, with your quiet ways and your steady hands and the way you never pushed, just waited for me to come to you. I would have waited forever, he said simply. Some things are worth waiting for. The community continued to visit as weather permitted. The story of Sarah's ride through the blizzard had spread throughout the valley, growing with each telling. By some accounts, she'd fought off wolves. In others, she'd carried Jack on her back the final mile. Sarah tried to correct the exaggerations, but people seemed to prefer the legend to the truth. Let them talk, Jack said one afternoon after a particularly embellished retelling from one of the Fenwick brothers. Stories like that, they matter out here. Give people something to hold on to when times get hard. I don't feel like a hero, Sarah confessed, and I was terrified the whole time. That's what makes it heroic. He caught her hand as she passed his bed. Being scared and doing it anyway. You taught me something. Sarah, I always thought strength meant not needing anyone. But real strength is being willing to need someone, and being strong enough to be needed in return. 2 weeks after the accident, Dr. Henley finally pronounced Jack fit to travel home. The Myers brothers brought a wagon modified with a thick bed of hay and blankets to cushion the journey. Half the valley, it seemed, turned out to see them off. You take care of that man, Martha Brennan instructed, pressing a basket of remedies into Sarah's hands. And yourself. You've been running on pure will for too long. Mrs. Fulton hugged her tight. You're welcome here any time, though next time, maybe visit when it's not blizzarding. The journey home was slow but uneventful. Sarah rode alongside the wagon, watching Jack's face for signs of pain, but he seemed content, even eager to be returning to their land, when their cabin came into view. Sarah felt her throat tighten. It looked exactly as they'd left it that morning 3 weeks ago, a lifetime ago. Smoke rose from the chimney where Frank Myers had kept the fire going. The cattle lowed from the barn, well tended by neighborly hands. Home, Jack said softly. Home, she agreed. Getting him inside and settled was an operation requiring both Myers brothers and creative use of a makeshift stretcher. But finally, Jack was in their own bed, in their own home, with their own things around them, after the brothers left with promises to check in regularly. Sarah stood in the doorway of their bedroom, suddenly uncertain. The crisis was past. The dramatic rescue was over. Now came the harder part, the daily work of recovery, of building a life together without the distraction of life or death drama. Come here, Jack said, patting the bed beside him. She sat carefully, mindful of his leg. What is it? I never thanked you properly for saving my life. You don't need to. Yes, I do. He cupped her face in his calloused palm. You rode through hell for me, Sarah. You brought me back from the edge of death with nothing but will and love. I don't have words big enough for that kind of thank you. Then don't use words, she suggested, leaning down to kiss him gently. When they parted, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I meant what I said in our wedding vows about riding through blizzards for you. But I never imagined you'd be the one to make good on it." "Well," Sarah said, striving for lightness despite her own emotional state. "Now we're even, though I'd prefer if neither of us needed rescuing for a good long while." "Agreed." He pulled her down to rest her head on his shoulder, solid and warm and alive. "Though I have to say, Mrs. Carver, being married to you is turning out to be more adventure than I bargained for." "Are you complaining?" "Never." His arm tightened around her. "Just observing that life with you will never be dull." Outside, the late winter sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. Inside, Sarah listened to Jack's steady heartbeat and felt the knot of fear she'd carried for so long finally begin to loosen. They'd faced the worst nature could throw at them and survived. More than survived, they'd forged something stronger in the crucible of crisis. Love, she realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing connection despite the fear, risking loss because the alternative, a life without deep bonds, was its own kind of death. She'd learned that lesson in the most dramatic way possible. Riding through a killing storm with only determination and a borrowed compass to guide her. Now came the rest of their lives, ordinary days and small moments, shared work and quiet evenings. Perhaps children if they were blessed. It wouldn't all be dramatic rescues and fever-bright declarations, but it would be theirs, built on a foundation of tested love and mutual courage. "I love you, Jack Carver," she said quietly into the peaceful afternoon. "And I love you, Sarah Carver," he replied. "My brave, stubborn, miraculous wife." They dozed then, safe in their own bed while outside the Wyoming winter continued its ancient dance. But spring would come, as it always did, and with it new growth, new life, new chances. They'd earned their happiness the hard way, through blizzards and broken bones, through fever and fear. Now all that remained was to live it. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year, reluctant as a shy bride. The snow retreated in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath like promises kept. Sarah watched the transformation from their kitchen window, kneading bread dough while behind her Jack practiced walking with the crutch Frank Myers had carved for him. "Easy," she said without turning around. "Dr. Henley said—" "I know what Doc Henley said," Jack interrupted, but his voice held amusement rather than irritation. "No weight on it for another week. I'm just testing the balance." She smiled, dusting flour from her hands. 3 months since the accident, and Jack was finally beginning to look like himself again. The gauntness had left his face, the gray pallor replaced by his natural weathered tan. His leg, while still weak, was healing straight and true. "Riders coming," Jack observed, peering out the window. "Looks like the Patterson wagon." Sure enough. Sam and Mary Patterson pulled into the yard minutes later, their wagon loaded with supplies and news from town. Mary burst through the door without knocking, as had become her habit. Sarah Carver, you'll never guess. She was practically vibrating with excitement. "The Territorial newspaper picked up your story. Look." She thrust a folded paper at Sarah. "Page 3. Brave wife conquers blizzard to save husband. They're calling you the Belle of the Blizzard." Sarah groaned. "Oh, Mary, no. That's the last thing I need." But Jack had already taken the paper, reading aloud. "In an act of courage that exemplifies the pioneer spirit, Mrs. Sarah Carver of Bitter Creek Valley rode 15 miles through the worst blizzard in memory to rescue her injured husband." He looked up, grinning. "Listen to this, armed only with determination and love. This modern heroine faced down nature's fury and won. They make it sound like I wrestled the wind itself. Sarah protested, her cheeks burning. Didn't you? Jack asked quietly, his gray eyes warm with something that still made her breath catch. Sam cleared his throat. Brought your mail, too. Letter from back east. Looks like... Sarah recognized her sister's handwriting immediately. Catherine had written faithfully since Sarah's first marriage, their correspondence a lifeline across the miles. She tucked the letter into her apron pocket to read later, when she could give it proper attention. After the Pattersons left, Mary still chattering about the newspaper article, Sarah found Jack standing at the corral fence, watching their horses graze on the new spring grass. His weight was carefully balanced on his good leg, the crutch bearing the rest. Penny for your thoughts, she said, joining him. Just thinking about time, he said. How it moves different out here. Feels like yesterday you were a widow helping with my harvest. Now look at us. Now look at us, she echoed. A matched pair of survivors. He turned to face her fully. I've been thinking about something else too. About family. Sarah's heart stuttered. They hadn't discussed children, not directly. The ghost of Emma still lingered too close, the fear of loss too fresh. Jack, I know you're scared, he said gently. After Emma. I understand that. But Sarah, this house, it's too quiet. It wants children. And I think, maybe, we do too. She looked away, toward the mountains. What if 100 things, he interrupted. What if the creek floods? What if the cattle get sick? What if another blizzard comes? We can't live our lives by what ifs. It's different with children. The fear is different. I know. He reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. But you're the woman who rode through a blizzard. You're stronger than any fear. That night, Sarah read Catherine's letter by lamplight while Jack dozed in his chair. Her sister wrote of city life, of concerts and socials, of her husband's promotion at the bank. It seemed like news from another world, one Sarah could barely remember inhabiting. But at the end, Catherine had written, I worry about you out there in that wilderness. But then I remember you were always the brave one. Even as children, you were the one climbing trees and facing down the neighbor's mean dog while I hid behind mother's skirts. I suppose some things don't change. Give my regards to your husband. He must be quite a man to have won you. Sarah folded the letter carefully, thinking about bravery and fear and the space between them. She looked at Jack, his face peaceful in sleep, the line of his jaw strong even in repose. He was quite a man indeed. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps they were ready for the next chapter of their story. 2 weeks later, Jack took his first unassisted steps across the cabin floor. Sarah watched from the doorway, ready to catch him if needed. But he made it to the far wall and back with only a slight limp. I'll be ready for spring roundup, he declared, triumphant. You'll be ready when Dr. Henley says you're ready, Sarah countered, but she was smiling. Though I admit it'll be good to have you back in the saddle. Frank Myers is a good neighbor, but he doesn't know our cattle like you do. That evening, they rode out together for the first time since the accident. Jack sat his horse carefully, favoring his weak leg, but his seat was steady. They rode the perimeter of their land, checking fences and water sources, planning for the busy months ahead. As they crested a small rise, the whole valley spread before them in the golden evening light. The cabin looked small but sturdy, smoke rising from the chimney. The barn and corrals were in good repair. Cattle grazed peacefully in the lower pasture. It was a modest empire, but it was theirs. I've been thinking about adding on to the cabin, Jack said suddenly. Another room or two, maybe a proper parlor. What do you think? Sarah heard what he wasn't quite saying. More rooms meant planning for a family, for growth, for a future that extended beyond just the two of them. "I think," she said carefully, "that would be wise. A house should have room to grow into." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "We've come through the worst, Sarah. The storm, the accident, the fear. We're still here." "Still here," she agreed, squeezing his fingers. They sat their horses in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. In a few weeks, the wildflowers would bloom, turning the meadows into carpets of color. The calves would come, demanding round-the-clock attention. There would be fences to mend, hay to cut, a garden to plant. And maybe, if they were blessed, there would be more. Children to teach about ranching and courage, stories to tell about the winter their mother rode through a blizzard, a legacy built not just on land and cattle, but on love tested by fire and found true. "We should head back," Jack said finally, and that leg's starting to ache. But as they turned their horses toward home, Sarah caught him looking back at the vista, a small smile playing at his lips. She knew that look. It was the expression of a man surveying his domain and finding it good. Finding it worth every struggle, every pain, every fearful night. The newspaper had called her a heroine, but Sarah knew better. Heroes were people in stories, larger than life and unburdened by doubt. She was just a woman who had loved and lost and found the courage to love again. A woman who had discovered that the opposite of loss wasn't safety, it was connection, deep and true and worth any risk. As they rode home through the gathering dusk, Sarah thought about the promise they'd made in that little chapel what seemed like a lifetime ago. To have and to hold, in sickness and in health. They'd tested those vows to their limits and found them stronger for the testing. Jack had promised to ride through blizzards for her, and she had no doubt he would, if needed. But she had done it first, proving that love wasn't about keeping score or taking turns. It was about showing up when it mattered, regardless of the cost. The lights of their cabin glowed warm in the distance, welcoming them home. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. A ranch didn't run itself, and spring was their busiest season. But tonight, they would share a simple meal, sit by their fire, and plan for the future they'd fought so hard to claim. "I love you, Jack Carver," Sarah said suddenly, the words escaping without thought. He turned in his saddle, his smile visible even in the growing darkness. "And I love you, Sarah Carver, my brave, brilliant, beautiful wife. Now you're just flattering me." "Maybe a little," he admitted. "But it's all true, every word in that newspaper article and more. You're a wonder, Sarah, my wonder." They rode the last stretch in comfortable silence, the stars beginning to appear overhead like promises written in light. The same stars that had witnessed their desperate journey through the blizzard now looked down on their quiet return. Two souls bound by more than vows, bound by shared trials and mutual salvation. The cabin door closed behind them with a solid sound, shutting out the vast Wyoming night. Inside was warmth and light and the life they were building together, day by day, season by season. It wasn't the life either had planned, but it was theirs, earned through courage and consecrated by love. And outside, the eternal mountains stood witness to their small human drama, indifferent and enduring, while the wind carried the scent of spring and new beginnings across the awakening land.